Laramie, Wyoming Territory, 1883. The advertisement Calvin Hurst placed in the Denver Republican described a cattle operation of considerable size in the Platte River Basin. It mentioned a well-appointed residence and a position of domestic partnership. It did not mention that the cattle operation consisted of 41 head of longhorns, 2 of which were currently missing, and 1 of which had not moved in 3 days, in a way that suggested it would never move again. The well-appointed residence was a log house, with a front door that did not fully close, and a back window that did not fully open, and the position of domestic partnership was a polite way of saying he needed someone to keep him from eating salt pork and cold coffee for the rest of his natural life. The advertisement Nora Graves placed through the matrimonial agency in St. Louis described a woman of practical temperament and sound household experience. It mentioned a background in domestic management and a willingness to relocate. It did not mention that Nora's domestic management experience consisted of running her late father's boarding house for 11 years, which was less a domestic skill and more a form of controlled chaos involving 12 opinionated men, 2 broken stoves, and a cat that had never been invited but refused to leave. It also did not mention that she had once knocked a man unconscious with a cast-iron skillet. In fairness to Nora, he had deserved it. Or that she had opinions about nearly everything and kept none of them to herself. They were both editing the truth. They were both about to be found out. Neither of them was ready for what happened next. I've spent a long time with stories like this one. The kind that start with a lie and end with something truer than either person expected. And I'll tell you what I've learned. The lie is never really the problem. The lie is just the door. What matters is what you find on the other side of it. Calvin Hurst was 38 years old and had the particular kind of quietness that comes not from having nothing to say but from having said things once and found that words rarely changed anything. He'd come to Wyoming from Ohio in 1876 with $200, a mule named Douglas, and the fixed belief that a man who worked hard enough could build something worth keeping. 7 years later, Douglas was dead. The $200 had long since become fence posts and feed bills, and the something worth keeping was a cattle operation that was, depending on the week, either marginally profitable or quietly catastrophic. He was not a man who complained. He was also not a man who asked for help. The advertisement in the Denver Republican had taken him forced drafts and approximately 6 weeks to submit, because asking for a wife felt to Calvin like admitting that solitude had limits, and he had spent 7 years trying to pretend it did not. He had written to the agency because of the winter. Not the last one specifically, though it had been brutal enough, but the cumulative weight of all of them. The winters when the wind came down off the Laramie Range, and the house made sounds like it was arguing with itself. And Calvin sat at his table eating alone and heard nothing but the stove and the wind and the particular silence of a man who has run out of reasons to talk. He needed someone who could cook, yes, and manage a household, yes, and help him through the seasons in a practical sense. But if I'm being honest with you, and this story demands honesty, what Calvin Hurst needed was another voice in the room. He just didn't know how to say that without sounding like something was wrong with him. Nora Graves arrived on the Union Pacific in October, which in Wyoming is already winter's first draft. Calvin was at the depot in Laramie. He had not shaved the morning of, which he would later claim was an oversight, and which was in fact a form of low-grade resistance to the entire situation. She stepped off the train carrying a large traveling bag, a smaller bag that clinked faintly when it moved, and an expression that suggested she was already cataloging everything in her field of vision and finding the inventory interesting. Calvin's first thought was, she looks like she's taking notes. His second thought was, she's going to be trouble. His third thought, which arrived approximately 4 seconds later when she walked up to him directly, extended her hand, and said, "You must be Calvin Hurst, your photograph made you look taller," was, "I have gotten exactly what I asked for and I am not sure I'm ready for it." She looked at the wagon. She looked at the horses. She looked at the road stretching north toward the Platte River Basin and said, "How far?" He said, "About 2 hours." She said, "In this?" He said, "It's a good wagon." She said, "The left rear wheel is wobbling." He looked at the left rear wheel. It was in fact wobbling. He had not noticed. She climbed in without waiting for him to help her. The ride north took 2 hours and 11 minutes. During that time, Calvin learned that Nora had strong opinions about the organization of supply depots, that she had read 3 books on cattle ranching during the 6 weeks between the agency's correspondence and her departure, and that she considered silence in conversation to be a form of either contemplation or rudeness, and was not yet sure which category his silences fell into. Calvin learned nothing else because he could not get a word in. The house. He had cleaned it. He wanted to make that clear, at least to himself, because he had spent the better part of Saturday clearing a path through 7 years of accumulated solitude. The stacked newspapers, the broken harness parts waiting to be mended, the 3 pairs of boots lined up by the stove in order of decreasing waterproofness. The house was clean, in the way that a thing can be clean if you define clean generously and don't look too closely at the corners. Nora looked at the corners. She did not say anything immediately. She set her bags down. She walked through the front room, the kitchen, looked into the back bedroom, returned to the kitchen. She turned and looked at Calvin with an expression he could not quite read, which unsettled him because he was not accustomed to faces he couldn't read. Partly because he so rarely bothered to look at them long enough. She said, "Your letter said well-appointed residence," he said. "It's appointed." She said minimally. He said, "I know where everything is." She said, "I believe you. I'm less convinced the mice do." That first night Nora cooked supper. It was a test, she told him, not of herself but of what she had to work with. The provisions were salted beef, dried beans, a sack of flour that had seen better decades, and 4 eggs of uncertain age. She made do. The biscuits were better than anything Calvin had produced in 7 years, because anything was better than what Calvin had been producing, which was a rotation of salt pork, cold beans and coffee that he made once every 3 days, and reheated until it had achieved a consistency that was less beverage and more geological formation. He ate everything. He said, "That's good," she said. "That's what happens when you have 4 eggs and I know what to do with them." He said, "What happens when there are no eggs?" she said. "I suppose we'll find out." What Calvin did not know that first night, what he had no way of knowing, was that Nora Graves had not come to Wyoming because she wanted to. She had come because she was 41 years old, which she had told the agency was 36, and she was tired in a way that has nothing to do with sleep. For 11 years she had run her father's boarding house on Mulberry Street in St. Louis. Her father, James Graves, had died in 1872, owing money to 6 different people and a reasonable amount of goodwill to precisely none of them, and had left Nora with the building, the debts and 12 residents who had nowhere else to go. She had kept them housed and fed. She had fixed the stoves herself twice. She had managed the books, negotiated the suppliers, and on one notable occasion evicted a man named Harold, last name withheld for reasons of her own dignity, who had spent 4 months failing to pay rent while spending elaborate effort convincing her to forgive it. Harold was the one with the cast iron skillet. He had also had it coming for longer than the eviction. By 1883 the boarding house was finally out of debt. It was also, for the first time in 11 years, no longer her problem. She'd sold it to a man from Cincinnati who'd shown up with cash money, and no apparent understanding of what he was purchasing. She had walked out of that building with a traveling bag, $400, and the sudden, vertiginous realization that she had spent 11 years keeping everyone else's life running, and had not once asked what she actually wanted from her own. The agency had been her sister Margaret's idea. Nora had been resistant. She had survived 11 years of men tracking mud through her hallways. She did not need to marry one. But then she had thought about it. Not marriage specifically, but the alternative. St. Louis, a new boarding house, more of the same rotation of other people's needs and her own competence deployed in service of a life that never quite felt like hers. She wanted land. She did not know why exactly, but she had always wanted it. Something she could see from edge to edge and know was not going anywhere. Something that stayed. The advertisement had said Platte River Basin, Wyoming Territory. She had looked it up on a map. She had read about it. She had then, methodically and with the seriousness she brought to everything, read everything she could find about cattle ranching, Wyoming winters, and the Laramie Range. She had not mentioned in her advertisement that she had opinions. She had not mentioned that she was 41. She had not mentioned the skillet. She had, however, mentioned sound household experience, and that at least was not a lie. The first month was an education in mutual adjustment, which is a polite way of saying that 2 people who had each been entirely self-sufficient for a very long time were now required to occupy the same house and make decisions together. And this was approximately as smooth as you would expect. Calvin did not tell her where things were kept. He operated on the assumption that things were where he had put them, and that this was self-evident, which it was, to him, and to no one else. Nora reorganized the kitchen inside the first week. Not to inconvenience him, but because the previous arrangement had been the organizational equivalent of a man putting his hat on the floor and then being surprised when he couldn't find it. He stood in his kitchen on a Tuesday morning looking for the coffee grinder and said very quietly, "Where is it?" she said. "Where it makes sense to be. Left cabinet, second shelf, beside the flour." He went and found it there. He did not say anything. This was his way of acknowledging she was right, which she was learning to recognize. She cooked. It was real cooking now, not the first night improvisation. Bread that rose, beans that had flavor, dried apple pie that she made on Sundays using the last of the fall apples, and a crust that Calvin ate standing at the kitchen counter before it had finished cooling, which she recognized as the highest form of compliment he was capable of. She had started a kitchen garden at the south side of the house, late in the season, too late for most things. But she was already planning for spring with the focused intensity of someone who had been given a project she intended to win. He watched her work. Not the way a man watches a woman, not at first, but the way a person watches someone who is very good at something and makes it look unremarkable. She had a method for everything. She had a method for the bread and a method for the accounts, and a method, apparently, for talking to the ranch hands, two of whom were brothers named Pruitt who had worked for Calvin for 3 years, and had never in that time had a conversation about anything except cattle and weather, and who were now, inexplicably, discussing with Nora the question of whether the south pasture drainage was the actual reason for the foot rot in the third quarter's calves. Calvin found them all standing at the south fence on a Thursday afternoon, engaged in what appeared to be a genuine agricultural debate. Nora was pointing at the ground. The Pruitt brothers were nodding. She was right about the drainage. He changed the rotation. He did not tell her she was right. She didn't need him to, she already knew. What Nora did not expect, what the books on cattle ranching had not covered, was the land itself. She had wanted land, yes, in the abstract, the way you want something you've never had and build it up in your imagination from the outside. The reality of Wyoming land was not the abstraction. It was wider, it was more indifferent. It was also on certain evenings when the light came down off the Laramie Range in long sideways sheets, and turned the Platte River the color of old copper, the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. She did not say this to Calvin. She said it to no one, which was itself strange for a woman who usually said everything to everyone. But there was something about the land that made her quiet in a way she hadn't been in years, maybe hadn't been since she was a girl sitting on her father's roof in St. Louis watching the river. Like the feeling required the silence to fit inside it. Calvin noticed she went outside after supper sometimes and just stood there. He didn't know what to make of it. He finally asked, one evening in November when the sky had gone the particular shade of dark blue that happens in Wyoming before the stars come out, all of them at once, like someone had given up trying to be subtle, he said, "What are you doing out here?" She said, "Looking." At what? She gestured at everything, all of it. He stood beside her for a moment. He said, "It's not bad." She looked at him. She said, "That might be the most understated thing I have ever heard a human being say." He considered it. He said, "It's something." She laughed. It was the first time he had heard her laugh. Not the sharp exhale of amusement she made when he said something obtuse, but an actual laugh, unguarded, and it did something unexpected to the quality of the silence that came after it. He went inside. He did not know what to do with the feeling, so he filed it under things to think about later and did not think about it for 3 more weeks. The thing that broke them open, that word sounds wrong but I can't think of a better one, was not a romantic moment, it was a fire. December 14, 1883. The temperature had dropped to 19 below and the wind was doing what Wyoming wind does in December, which is make you understand on a cellular level why the first settlers wrote so many letters home describing their mistake. Calvin was in the barn with the cattle and the 2 Pruitt brothers doing the kind of winter preparation that is less work than it is a long argument with mortality. Nora was in the house. The stovepipe in the kitchen, the one Calvin had been meaning to clean since September, which in the language of frontier life means had been actively ignoring since September, caught a crease from a grease fire on the stovetop and the crease became a crack and the crack became a problem faster than any of them predicted. She didn't panic. This is the part I want you to hold on to. She did not panic. She had lived above a boarding house for 11 years with 12 male residents, 2 broken stoves and a cat, and she had learned that panic does not put out fires. She got the rugs out the front door. She got the food stores to the porch. She went back in for the account books. Calvin's 7 years of records, which she had found in a crate under his bed, and which she had spent 3 weeks reorganizing into something coherent. And she carried the crate outside. She went back in one more time for the box under the kitchen floorboard, which she had found in the 3rd week when a board had shifted under her foot and which she had never mentioned to Calvin because it was clearly his private concern, and which she took outside because whatever was in it was clearly his private concern, and he deserved to keep it. Then she went to the barn. She said, "Calvin, kitchen fire. It's out, but the pipe is damaged and there's smoke damage on the north wall. Your account books are on the porch." He stared at her. She said, "The cattle are fine, the barn is fine, the house is mostly fine. You need to see the pipe." He had been in the middle of a sentence to Pruitt Jr. He left the sentence unfinished. He went to the house. He looked at the porch, at the rugs, the food stores, the account books in their crate, at the small wooden box he had not opened in 4 years. He picked up the box. She said, from behind him, "I didn't open it." He said, "I know," he said after a pause, "my wife, first wife. Letters." She said nothing. This was unusual enough that he turned and looked at her. She said, "I'm sorry." He said, 7 years ago. She said, still he stood there with the box. He said, "She would have panicked." Nora said, "Some people do." He said, "You didn't." She said, "I've had practice." He looked at her with the particular look of a man recalculating something he thought he had already figured out. He set the box down. He looked at the pipe damage. He looked at the north wall. He said, "You went back in 3 times." She said, 4. He said, "You could have." She said, "I didn't though." There was a long pause. Calvin was not a man who found words quickly, but when he found them they tended to be the right ones. He said, "Why did you take the box?" She said, "Because it was yours and you should be the one to decide what happens to it." He nodded very slowly. He set the box on the porch railing. He said, "The pipe needs replacing. I'll get the part from Laramie in the morning." She said, "I can make do on the camp stove until then." He said, "I know you can." He went and put the box back under the floorboard that she had replaced exactly as she found it, the nail tapped back in straight. That night they ate at the table by lamplight because the kitchen was cold and the camp stove was in the front room. She made beans and cornbread on a camp stove in 19 below weather, and it was, Calvin told her, the best meal he'd had since he'd come to Wyoming. She said, "That's a low bar," he said. "I'm raising it." She looked at him across the table. He looked back. Neither of them said what they were both thinking, because they were both people who had spent a long time being careful, and careful people don't say things until they're sure they mean them. But something had changed. Not dramatically. Not with a declaration. Just, differently than before. I should tell you about the box, because it's part of the story. Helen Hurst had been Calvin's wife from 1878 to 1880, 2 years, and had died of typhoid in the summer of the second year. He had not spoken of her to anyone in Wyoming because Wyoming didn't know her, and grief shared with strangers felt to Calvin like a different kind of loss. The letters in the box were hers, written to her mother in Ohio, which her mother had sent him after Helen died because she thought he should have them. He had not read them since 1880. He had carried them with him because he did not know what else to do with them, and the not knowing had become its own kind of carrying. Nora had figured out there was a first wife somewhere around the 3rd week. She had said nothing. She was, when the situation called for it, a woman who understood the difference between what was her business and what was not. She never asked about Helen directly. She didn't have to. She understood the way certain people understand things, not from being told but from paying attention, that Helen was not competition and was not a shadow and was not a reason for anything except the particular brand of loneliness that lives in a man who knows exactly what he lost. January came in the way Wyoming Januaries do, which is without apology. The cold settled into the ranch the way a creditor settles into a conversation. Everywhere, persistent, not especially interested in your feelings about it. Nora spent the mornings at the kitchen table with Calvin's account books and her own calculations, doing something she had not told him she was planning to do, not because it was deceptive, but because she wanted to be sure before she said it out loud. She had found, in going through the accounts, that the cattle operation's biggest drain was not the winter feed costs, which was what Calvin assumed, but the spring calf losses, which were running higher than they should be, because the calving pasture was too far from the barn for close monitoring in bad weather. She had drawn a diagram. She had run the numbers 4 different ways. She had read, in one of the ranching books she'd brought from St. Louis, about a practice being adopted in the Texas Panhandle of maintaining a dedicated calving structure within 80 yards of the main barn. She brought it to Calvin on a Sunday morning in January with her diagram and her numbers and waited. He looked at the diagram for a long time. He said, "You figured this from the accounts?" She said, "It took most of November." He said, "You didn't say anything." She said, "I wasn't sure yet." He looked at the numbers. He said, "This would take most of the spring budget." She said, "It would save more than it costs within 3 calving seasons. The numbers say so." He looked at her over the top of the paper. He said, "You did read those books." She said, "I told you I did." He said, "I thought you were being polite." She gave him a look that suggested she considered politeness a somewhat alien concept. He built the calving structure in March. It took him, the priests, and a borrowed mule 14 days. Nora brought them lunch every day and did not say anything that could be interpreted as "I told you so," which cost her something, but she paid it. The first calving season with the new structure, they lost 2 calves. The previous year they had lost 9. Calvin told Pruitt Sr. it was the new setup. Pruitt Sr. said it was good thinking. Calvin said it wasn't mine. And then he didn't elaborate, which was his way, but Pruitt Sr. had been paying attention for 3 months and understood perfectly. Spring came to Wyoming, which is less a season than a negotiation. The ground argued about thawing. The river ran high and brown with snowmelt. Nora's kitchen garden, which she had planned all winter with the focused intensity of a general planning a campaign, went in the ground in late April. Tomatoes, beans, squash, herbs in a careful border along the south wall. She was on her knees in the mud on a Thursday morning, entirely focused on a bean row, when Calvin came and stood at the edge of the garden and watched her for a while. She said without looking up, "If you're going to stand there, you might as well hand me that line marker." He handed her the line marker. He crouched down at the edge of the bed. He said, "Nora." She was still focused on the beans. She said, He said you wrote to the agency that you were 36. She went still. She sat back on her heels. She turned and looked at him directly, the way she looked at everything, as if evasion were a waste of everyone's time. She said, "I'm 41. He said, "I know. I wrote to the agency that I had a cattle operation of considerable size." She said, "I know. I looked at the accounts." He said, 41 head and one of them questionable." She said, 63 now, after the spring calves. "None of them questionable." He said, "That's because of you." She said, That's because of the structure and the rotation and the drainage fix and, he said. Nora. She stopped. I wrote a bad letter, you wrote a bad letter, I think we're even. She looked at him. Something moved across her face that was not quite a smile but was in the direction of one. She said, your letter said well-appointed residence. He said, I've been working on it. She said, you have, the door closes now. He said, mostly. She said, the front window still sticks? He said, I'm aware of the window, she said. I'll put it on the list. He said, Nora. I mean to ask you something and I'd rather just ask it than talk around it for another 4 months, she said. Then ask it, he said. Will you stay? Not because the agency says you're here for a year and the year isn't finished. Because you want to. She looked at him for a long time. She was not a woman who answered quickly when the answer mattered. She said, I came here wanting land I could see from edge to edge and know it wasn't going anywhere, he said. And? She said, it stays. The land stays, the river stays, even the window stays, though not in the position we'd prefer. He said, is that a yes? She said, it's the most comprehensive yes I know how to give. He nodded. He picked up the line marker and held it out again for the next row. She took it. She turned back to the beans. They were married in Laramie in June 1884 by a justice of the peace because the Methodist Church had a 2-week wait and neither of them saw the point of waiting. Nora wore a dress she'd made herself in green wool, because green was practical and she'd never been a white dress kind of woman. Calvin wore his good shirt. There were 4 people in attendance. The Pruitt brothers, a woman named Alice from the dry goods store who Nora had befriended in October, and who cried in a way that suggested she found the whole enterprise deeply satisfying, and Alice's husband, who did not fully understand the occasion but shook Calvin's hand with enthusiasm. Over the next 22 years, they turned 41 head of questionable longhorns into a cattle operation that was, by the standards of Platte River Basin ranching, genuinely considerable. The calving structure was followed by a proper bunkhouse, and the bunkhouse by a second barn, and the second barn by a house addition with a room Nora designated as the office, and Calvin designated as wherever she kept the account books, which amounted to the same thing. The kitchen garden became a proper kitchen garden, then a small orchard of apple and plum, then a 1/4 acre of vegetables that supplied not only the ranch but, on surplus years, the general store in Laramie. Nora became the person every rancher's wife in the Platte River Basin came to when they had an account problem. Because Nora Graves Hurst could look at numbers the way other people read faces and know within the first column what the real story was. She never charged for this. She also never let anyone leave her kitchen table without a cup of coffee, and whatever she considered her honest opinion, both of which were strong. Calvin read. This surprised everyone who knew him, because Calvin had not been a reader. Not because he couldn't but because books had seemed to him like the kind of thing you did when the work was finished. And the work was never finished. Nora had opinions about this. Not loudly. But she had a habit of leaving books on the kitchen table or the chair arm or one memorable occasion on top of his hat. And eventually he started picking them up. He read slowly and he read carefully and he remembered everything he read, which Nora said was the best kind of reading there was. He told a man at the Laramie feedlot in 1891 that she had changed the way he understood what he was doing out here. Not the cattle, the land, the whole thing. The man asked what he meant. Calvin thought about it for a minute and then said that he'd come here, thinking survival was the point, and somewhere along the line he'd been persuaded that survival was just the beginning. The man asked who'd persuaded him. Calvin said, my wife. Nora Graves Hurst died in 1921 at the age of 79. Calvin had died 4 years earlier, and she had spent the last 4 years of her life running the ranch accounts, tending the orchard, and writing letters to her nieces in St. Louis in a hand that was to the end, direct and legible, and said exactly what she meant. Calvin Hurst had told his neighbor once, in the way of a man who did not make speeches but knew the weight of a true thing. I sent for someone to keep the house. What showed up was someone who kept everything else too. Made me wonder what I thought I was doing out here before she arrived. She had come expecting land she could call her own. He had come expecting someone to manage the household. They were both wrong about what they were actually looking for. And what they found instead, built out of a bad stovepipe and cold beans, and one very direct woman on her knees in a bean row in the April mud, was sturdier than anything either of them had planned for. I've been thinking about that lately. About how the things we ask for and the things we need are sometimes so far apart that it takes a lie to get us in the same room with the truth. Calvin Hurst didn't need a housekeeper. Nora Graves didn't need a title to land. They needed both of them, a person who would stay. Not because they had to, but because the thing they'd built together turned out to be worth staying for. Now I want to ask you something, the same question that's been on my mind since I first came across this story. Who do you think changed more? Calvin, who came in thinking survival was enough and had to be taught otherwise, or Nora, who arrived with every answer and had to learn which questions she hadn't thought to ask? Tell me in the comments. And if this kind of story is what you come here for, there's another one waiting for you. A different frontier. A different pair of people equally certain they knew what they needed, and equally wrong. It's right here when you're ready.